All right, so I'm going to show you the increment and decrement example. Some students kind of get confused by that because not only is there increment and decrement, but there's also a pre and post increment decrement. And when those operations actually happen kind of can be a little confusing. So I've already created a file called increment decrement example.java. So I'm going to make the class for this. So public class increment decrement example. Oops. Open close curly braces, put in my main method header, public static void main string array arguments, open close curly braces. And let's not forget our info up top. So come over here, put the name and info. All right, so we learned that we can increment and decrement a integer, and that's going to add 1 or subtract 1 to it. So let's go ahead and just make a quick example. So I'm going to say int count, and we'll just say our count is currently 5. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to print out my value. And I'm going to just say count, and then print out the value of count. Okay, let me just copy this. All right, so then what I'm going to do is I'm going to decrement my count. Okay, and I'm going to just print out my value of count. And then I'm going to decrement my count again. Print out my value of count. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the value of count. Make it 10, print out the value of count, and then I'm going to increment count, print out the value, and then increment it again, and print out the value. All right, so I'm going to compile using Control-1. That compiles. Let me make sure I didn't have any errors, and I didn't. That's always a good sign. So run the program, and we started off at 5. So let's look at our code really quick. Let's compare this side by side with our code. So, oops, what the heck? Get over there. All right. Okay, so in our code, I start off at 5, and then I printed out the value of 5. I decremented, and then I printed out the value of 5. So it's 4. That makes sense. I decremented again, this time with the pre-decrement. I printed out my value, and I have a 4. And then what I did is I set my value of count to 10, and then I incremented and print out the value, so it makes it 11, makes sense. And then I incremented again, but this time with the pre-increment, and I printed out my value, and I have 12. Okay, so everything makes sense. Okay, now the only thing that isn't clear right now is what the pre and the post decrement actually do. Now, it can be a little confusing, but the way that I remember it is if it's a pre, meaning it comes before the variable, that means it happens on that line. And if it's a post, meaning the operators are at the end of the variable, that means the change of that value happens after the line is complete. So if it has the incrementation or decrementation at the end, that means it happens after the line is complete. If it has it in the front, that means that it happens in place at that spot. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this out really quick. I'm gonna go ahead and close this and make this a little bigger. Okay, so let's think of an example of this. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and just set count to 0. Okay, and now what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna sit in place in my system out print line, count to 0. So, let me just print out count first before I do any incrementation. Okay, print out count. Now what I want to do is I want to say, okay, well, I print out count. Now what is plus plus count? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and print out plus plus count, and let's see what actually happens. So I compile and I run, and you can see that nothing happened. What the heck? Did it compile? Compile and run. Okay, there we go. And count was 0, and I did the pre-increment, and I and the value is 1 makes sense. So when it's pre, that means it happens in line. Now I know this can be a little confusing with the pluses right there, so I always recommend to students, if something looks confusing, just wrap it in parentheses, right? So that it looks like, okay, well, you're doing this right there, wrapping it, and now you can print out the value. Okay, so let's go ahead and try this one more time. We're going to set it back to 0, but this time we're going to go with the post increment, and let's see what our result is. Okay, so this time I'm actually going to increment, but I'm putting the plus signs at the end of the variable. So I'm going to compile and run, and you can see that the value right after, let me just change my output really quick. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and correct this so that we know what we're actually doing. So I'm going to put this at the end. Let me close this, compile, there you go, run. Okay, and you can see that the post increment stayed 0, right? So when I did the pre-increment, I said count to 0, then I pre-incremented, the value is 1 when I did my system out print line. Then I set the value back to 0, and then I did my post increment, and the value stayed at 0. Okay, so what's actually happening here is the value of count did change. The value took place, but it didn't take place until after the line was complete. So it waited until the system out print line was complete, right there, like when it sees that semicolon, that's the end of the line, then the value actually changed. And I can verify this by just printing out the value of count after that line. So let's go ahead and do that. Control 1 to compile, Control 2 to run, and now you can see that count is in fact 1 because I did increment it, but because I used the post increment, the value change did not happen on that line. It happened when the line was complete. The same rules apply for the decrement. So pre means it happens in place in that line. Post means it will happen, but the value doesn't take place until the line is complete. So if you're doing this in a math problem, whatever the current value is going to be what's going to be used if you're using the post increment. It's not going to use the incremented value. The incremented value is going to only take effect after that line is complete.